Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I am Kemper Donovan, and welcome to part 2 of my big ol' listener mailbag episode, an episode so big I had to break it up into 2 parts. That's how much you all love writing to me and how much I love getting everything that you write to me. Happy Valentine's Day, listeners. I can't think of a better way to celebrate a day dedicated to love than by luxuriating in your many messages. I feel very loved by all of you, and I hope by the end of this episode, we will all feel that love. So let's get started. Before I begin, I have some spoiler warnings. The following Christie stories will be spoiled to varying degrees. Curtain, The Double Clue, The Hollow, Lord Edgeworth Dies, The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side, A Murder is Announced, Murder on the Orient Express, Nemesis, 1-2 Buckle My Shoe, and Towards Zero. All right, as I always do, I'll be starting with the more recent episodes and working my way backward. So my first listener mail is a response to my interview with Sophie Hannah regarding No One Would Do What the Lamberts Have Done. This is a fresh response here from my very last episode. Here goes. Kemper, at the risk of indulging in my own literary myopia, I was surprised that neither you nor Sophie Hannah considered Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz when discussing the lengths animal parents will traverse in order to protect a beloved dog from an unreasonable neighbor. Miss Gulch, of course, is a creation of the screenplay writer, but even in the book, Dorothy slapped a lion and doused a witch to save her Toto. Aside from that very minor and perhaps unreasonable criticism, I enjoyed the episode very much and look forward to getting my hands on Sophie's book. Excellent point, listener. Dorothy Gale certainly does go on quite a journey, and the origins of that journey are her love for her dog Toto. Next up, I've got a response to part 1 of my listener mailbag episode. Here goes. Happy New Year, Kemper, and thank you for your mailbag episode on the podcast. I always enjoy those, and some very interesting points were made. You asked how somebody should be addressed if they are a lord or sir, etc., but also hold military rank. The military rank always comes first, slightly surprisingly, perhaps. So, to use the example of the UK's great military hero, he was Field Marshal the Duke of Wellington. And a knighted captain, say, would be Captain Sir plus first name and surname. Sometimes socially, outside of military circles, the peerage title alone might be used, but the above is correct formal usage. Interesting what an Agatha Christie novel brings up. Indeed, and amazing what the All About Agatha hive mind is capable of when put to the test. I knew that you wouldn't disappoint me. Side note, but if any of you have watched the brilliant show Pluribus, created by the brilliant Vince Gilligan, you'll understand that I really can't ever use the phrase hive mind now without shuddering. Moving on. Next message is in response to my episode about the Christie short story, The Gypsy. This was my Halloween Spooktacular episode of last year. Hi, Kemper. I just listened to your podcast about The Gypsy. What I found interesting is you mentioning the difficulty for the two characters of getting together because she's 8 years older than him. Because if this was indeed written in the 1930s and not earlier, it was at a time when Agatha Christie herself was already married to a man 14 years younger than her. Just wanted to mention this because you drew some comparison to Christie's real life through her autobiography in this episode as well. And yes, in that episode, I had talked about the uncertainty over the initial publication date, the serialization for that short story. But this is an excellent point, and I think another reason to be very curious about that initial publication date. We do know that the age gap between Agatha and Max was initially a bar to her accepting his proposal of marriage, but she got over it. I'm sure it didn't cease to be something that she thought about, however, from time to time. So very, very interesting thought. Thank you for that. Next, I have 2 responses actually to my episode in which I reviewed 2 vintage Agatha Christie television adaptations that had recently been made available to us. The early 60s Martin Gable Poirot pilot episode and that Estonian Miss Marple series. So both of these messages actually have to do with the Poirot that I discussed on that episode. Here goes. Hi, Kemper. Starting with the most important news, I have pre-ordered the book and now just have to find some way to occupy myself until next June. What an A+++ listener, pre-ordering my third ghostwriter mystery, Sweet Spot, which is out this summer. Have I mentioned you can click on a link in the show notes to pre-order it for yourselves? I have? Many times? Okay. Well, let's get back to this listener's message then. Thank you for sharing the 2 rare television episodes associated with your last podcast. I've long wanted to see the Poirot pilot, and I was so happy to have the chance, as well as to hear your thoughts. I agreed with nearly everything you said about it. I have to wonder if a better choice of an opening story might have improved the show's chances of being out into production. There's a lot to recommend the pilot, but the selection of Davenham was pretty self-defeating. Gable really did work a lot during that period. Shortly after the pilot aired, he took on the role of Professor Moriarty in the Sherlock Holmes Broadway musical, Baker Street. It's not Oklahoma, but it's not bad. Given your recent rediscovery of the Holmes canon, what he's referencing there is a Patreon episode in which I discussed The Hound of the Baskervilles. This listener is my best salesman, clearly. Given your recent rediscovery of the Holmes canon, you might enjoy listening to the score. He did indeed show up a lot on What's My Line, not least because he was married to regular panelist Arlene Francis. The Poirot limo was one of the more entertaining variations from the source material. I did want to point out that it wasn't quite James Bond stuff in 1962. There were indeed car phones then. The technology was first introduced right after World War II, and by 1962, many major cities had the infrastructure for mobile phones. There could only be a few hundred in a given city, but they existed. About a year after Poirot used his, Burke's Law premiered, and Gene Barry was making limousine phone calls to solve murders all day long. Television sets in cars were less common because the manufacturers didn't provide them, but by the early 60s, there were custom designers, Cartisans, who would install limousine TVs. So I don't think the Poirot mobile was exactly meant to make the show a fantasy. Rather, they seem to have wanted to emphasize Poirot's wealth and level of fame and success as a detective. The limo TV also had the added value of providing quick exposition, and had the series sold, I'm sure we would have learned all of the Hastings newspaper info from the TV reporters at the beginning of each episode. Thank you again for the links and for your impressions. And thank you for that fascinating historical context, listener. I had no idea that there were car phones and limo televisions in the early 1960s. That is fascinating. I love it. And then here is another message from another listener, also about the Martin Gable pilot. Kemper, I enjoyed the latest episode, but there were at least a couple of important missing trivia details that surprised me. The first was regarding Martin Gable. You pointed out that he was famous for appearing as a frequent What's My Line panelist. What you didn't mention was the reason why he so frequently appeared as such. If you don't know the reason, I'll leave it to you to find out. It won't be difficult to get the answer, and I'd say it more than doubles his Graham Norton factor. And of course, the reason is that he was married to panelist Arlene Francis. I didn't even have to Google to get that answer, since my other listener had already provided me with the information. So there. All right, back to this listener's message. As for Nina Foch, who incidentally was at one point married to Inside the Actors Studio host James Lipton, little clue there, you mentioned many of her career highlights, but not her other major Agatha Christie connection. She appeared as Vera Claythorne in the 1959 NBC TV version of 10 Little Indians. Well, thank you for that televisual context, listener. It's like I have my own personal IMDb. I'm very grateful for you all filling in the gaps like this. All right, let's move on to a message in response to my interview with Steen Joost, Wikipedia administrator for Dutch language Agatha Christie articles. This was the episode in which Steen and I pondered briefly the question of whether there were any Agatha Christie mysteries that hinged on mushroom poisoning. A number of you wrote in about this. I already covered most of those responses in part 1 of my listener mailbag episode, but here is another one. Hi, Kemper. Not strictly speaking an Agatha Christie novel, but in the 12 New Marple stories, which came out a couple of years ago, one of the stories in that collection does feature death by poisonous mushrooms. I love Agatha Christie's writing, and I'm pretty traditional in my views about this kind of thing, but some of these new stories are super, and some aren't. The one featuring the mushrooms is called The Second Murder at the Vicarage, written by Val McDermid. I have the Audible version, which is wonderfully narrated in this instance by Adrian Scarborough, enhancing the experience. For those who don't know the name, he is the Chelsea detective. Thank you for that shout out to those new Marple stories, listener. I think it's well worth the mention. All right, I now have a bunch of messages to go through responding to the last episode that I did with the Reverend Dr. Sarah Hinlicky Wilson regarding Star Over Bethlehem and Other Stories, that wonderful little collection that we have been poring over together the last few years. At this point, the last story that Sarah and I covered in that collection was In the Cool of the Evening. And we did that last year as a Christie for Easter, which was fitting since these stories are so Christian themed. And I just have to tell you that if everything goes according to plan, Sarah and I will be back this Easter with our analysis of the one story in that collection that we have yet to cover. That would be The Water Bus. So I'm very excited about that one. And I have just gotten so much love from so many of you regarding Dr. Wilson, who is such a Christie fan and such an expert in Christian theology. And she just brings so much added enjoyment and edification to our experience of these stories. So I am not surprised to have gotten a whole bunch of responses to our In the Cool of the Evening episode. And before I get into those messages, just as the briefest of refreshers, this is the story in which a mother, Janet Grierson, is upset because her beautiful, but perhaps what we would nowadays call neurodivergent son, Alan, doesn't seem to be quote unquote normal. And she prays for him to be made right, but feels when she prays in church that God isn't there. Not that he doesn't exist, but that he isn't there in the church. And then we cut to Alan himself, who has been cavorting outside within nature, as children do. And he's made all sorts of friends, including these mutant animals created by way of the accident at the research station, which seems to be some sort of radiation from a local nuclear power plant. Yes, really? And while Janet is repulsed by these creatures, the lesson that I believe we're meant to take from all this is that Alan's acceptance of these creatures and Alan's father's acceptance of him, which contrasts with Janet's, is the better attitude. Since the main friend who Alan has made out here in nature is in fact God himself, with whom the boy has been walking in the titular cool of the evening. And this is why God was absent from church when Janet was praying so fervently, yet so fruitlessly. And this story is followed in the collection by a poem called Jenny by the Sky, which Sarah and I also discussed on that episode. We both assumed that the narrative voice in this poem was a masculine one, a man who was expressing both ownership over and desire for this woman named Jenny, and who was frustrated by Jenny's failure to do his bidding. This narrator talks of vibing, basically, with God, who is also necessarily frustrated by so many of his creations. And the reason I'm reminding you all of this interpretation, which was both of our interpretation, it's not like one of us had to convince the other to read it this way. We both read it that way. The reason I'm reminding you is that at least two of you out there had a very different interpretation that I found fascinating. All right, so here goes. First message. Hi, Kemper. I just listened to your Christie for Easter episode, and I had some, perhaps vaguely formed, thoughts about In the Cool of the Evening that I wanted to share. It is not a great story, but it strikes me that there is a positive way to interpret the unsettling mutants that accords with the theme of faith I hear in the story. The mutants were caused by an act of evil, certainly, but they themselves are innocent. If God ordained evolution to bring forth all the wonderful plants and animals on Earth, and finally man, then new species appearing is not a new thing for him. Surely he will find a place for them in his divine plan, and through them create even more beauty and joy? I think we are called upon to have faith in the ultimate goodness of his plan, and trust that however unsettling or strange the creatures appear, that there is a purpose and that they are loved by God as surely as all living things are. The boy is disappointing to his mother and doesn't fit in with everyone else, but his father is able to simply accept him and love him as he is, trusting in God that all is well. In a more extreme way, the mutants are disturbing and don't fit in, but the boy trusts God and just loves them for what they are, rather than judging them for what they are not. In this, I confess that I am drawing on J.R.R. Tolkien's Silmarillion, where Melkor, Lucifer, tries to oppose the will of Eru, God, and act in defiance of his plan. Eru tells him, to paraphrase, that there is nothing that Melkor can will or do that does not have its ultimate origin in him, and that no matter what evil he does, Eru will turn it to an even greater good. and that at the end, Melkor will see that all his acts of defiance will have only had the effect of glorifying God and bringing forth things even more wonderful and beautiful. So I see no problem with God taking the terrible industrial accident and from it bringing forth new things that will, in time, be seen to be even more wonderful. Sorry for the long diatribe, smiley face. Also, when you read the poem at the end, I confess I got a completely different understanding of it. What I heard was a mother talking about her child. The mother is sad that the daughter, Jenny, that she gave birth to, i.e. created, has left her side to wander the world. I hear her loneliness and a greedy longing to keep her with her all the time, tempered with an acceptance that her daughter needs her own life and freedom. At the end, I hear her thinking with love and worry about her daughter that has wandered away from her, and feeling a kinship with God who created men, and is also watching them wander away from him and feeling a perhaps similar love and worry. They are both accepting the choices of their wayward children and waiting for them to return to them. I found it very touching. Just some ramblings of a pagan. Thanks again for your wonderful podcast and your great guests. And I shared this message with the Reverend Dr. Sarah Hindley Wilson, and here was her response. Tolkien was definitely articulating a Christian view of reality, so I think the connection here makes sense. The fine line, as always, is to what extent this view ends up licensing or condoning evil, because after all, God will bring something good of it. It makes a big difference if you are speaking from a moral perspective or a theological perspective, which is why there is never any satisfying resolution to theodicy questions as long as we remain in this vale of tears. And what she means is that as long as we are talking about how we should or do live our lives here on Earth, as opposed to what might happen in the afterlife, right? That model of, well, everything's going to turn out for the best anyway, can absolutely be taken too far, and people could just do horrible, horrible things on the understanding that it's all good in the end. That is a theological perspective, but we do have to live our lives with more of a moral perspective. I believe that is what Sarah is getting at there, and I think it's an excellent point. I also think that this listener has an excellent point. I loved that message. Thank you. And now here is another one. Hi, Kemper and Dr. Sarah. I enjoyed your conversation about this story and its religious themes, which indeed characterize this collection. I've not read them myself, so I listened with interest. I wondered if there were a few different views to take, apart from the monstrous results of the experiments. Could Christie, that is, Christie Mallowan, be envisioning a God more accepting of change than Mrs. Grierson? Janet demands things be the way they've always been, and that we believe as we've always believed, whereas the God, speaking with Alan, seems to know and accept changes in this world and society that happen over time. Could this just be her attempt at accepting them herself? Also, the two of you assumed a masculine voice for the poem. I confess on Sarah's read-through, I assumed a feminine, matronly voice, and wondered if your view of this character, created as she was from love and longing, would have been at all altered had her name been not Jenny, but Rosalind. A mother longing for connection with a heedless daughter just might have hit my ear more comfortably than some otherwise God-attuned incel. Shrug. Just a thought. I do know the main influence I was hearing in the short story itself was potentially Ray Bradbury, but that's neither here nor there. Love your work. Thanks for the exploration. Keep it up. And then here is Sarah's response. This really fascinates me because it literally never once occurred to me that it could be a mother, even following on a story about a mother and son. I think the phrase, I have made Jenny, seems so, well, unmaternal, unless that's the point, a distorted mother's love. Further evidence of Agatha's obsession with mothers and what makes a good or a bad one. Definitely worth sharing this one on your next mailbag. I agree, Sarah, which is why I'm sharing it now. And I have to say, I reread the poem after reading these messages, and I think it's lines like the opening stanza of the poem that just obliterated any thought of a mother speaking to her child for me. Come down to me, Jenny, come down from the hill, come down to me here where I wait. Come down to my arms, to my lips, my desire. Come down all my hunger to sate. To me, this feels like a male desire and possessiveness of a woman. But I obviously take both listeners' points, and I think it's significant that they had the same point about the poem. The gender of a narrator in Christie is not always 100% clear. I am reminded right now of the short story Within a Wall, which I recently covered with Dr. Michelle Kasmer. And if Agatha Christie or Agatha Christie Mallowan had wanted to make the gender of this narrative voice clear, she would have. So that's very interesting stuff. Also, I just have to congratulate all of us who are engaging in this debate over the interpretation of Agatha Christie Mallowan's Jenny by the Sky poem in the Star Over Bethlehem collection. We have officially created a new definition of in the weeds, and I am here for it. I mean, I am literally right here for it. So next message, we continue on in the weeds. We still have more to cover as to this story. Hi, Kemper. As always, I enjoyed this episode with yourself and Sarah. I want to make a point about Janet, the mother in the story, but I preface my remarks by saying I'm not a mother, so maybe I don't have a right to make this observation. Just pausing to say, you absolutely do, listener. Let's continue. But my take on Janet was that her determination to make her son normal may have been born out of a sense of guilt. However irrational it may be, I think a woman may feel, or be made to feel, responsible if her child is born with a disability. She may think she did something which resulted in her child's developmental difficulties. By the way, Jesus didn't hold with this explanation for disability, as we see in the following passage. As he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" "Neither this man nor his parents sinned," said Jesus, "but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him." And that is from the book of John. This listener continues, "It also occurs to me that the early 60s was when it was realized that the anti-nausea drug taken by many mothers had resulted in children born with disabilities, and that may have been a factor in this kind of story appearing in the Christie oeuvre at that time." And I'll just pause to note that this anti-nausea drug the listener is referencing is thalidomide, which was made available to pregnant women as an anti-nausea medication in the late 1950s until it was quickly realized that it was, in fact, very harmful to the gestational process. And there was huge awareness around this at the time and in the immediate aftermath, which would have been when Christie was writing a lot of these stories, even though it is difficult to pinpoint precisely when many of these stories were written. Just closing out this message, I hope this adds another angle on the story, and I'm really looking forward to the last one from this collection. I'm also very much looking forward to the proposed episode on the clergy of Christie. And here is how Dr. Sarah responded to this message. "In theory, a good theory, but I didn't see any evidence that Janet felt personal guilt over the child, or that he had been the result of experiments at the station going awry too." My response is that I think it's a really interesting theory, especially since it makes me think of an Agatha Christie mystery that just came out 3 years earlier. Many of you know exactly what I'm about to say, The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side. And that story involves a woman whose baby is born with severe challenges as a result of something that happened while she was pregnant. In that case, the guilt is squarely put on someone else's shoulders other than the mother, but the mother is in fact the one who murders the guilty party. It goes to the very heart of the mystery. And I do think it's really interesting to look at in the cool of the evening and The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side, side by side. I certainly never thought to do that till getting this message. So thank you for that, listener. Very, very interesting. And then there was one last wrinkle with this story that a few of you wrote in about, so I have to mention it. This story opens at evensong, which is when Janet is in church and praying for Alan, her son, to be changed. And since this story takes place at this service and then immediately after, when Janet and her husband go home to Alan, it makes sense that it would be an evening service, since we're in the cool of the evening, after all. But when the rector speaks from the pulpit during this evening service, he quotes Psalm 95, which immediately stood out to a number of you. Here is one listener. Quick Anglican/Church of England fact check from a former choir girl. Psalm 95 is part of the Matins morning service liturgy, known by its Latin opening word, so the Venite. And of course, Agatha Christie Mallowan, devout Christian that she is well aware of this. She actually prefaces the quote from Psalm 95 in the story with the following: "Part of the psalm we sing every Sunday morning." So why is the rector using Psalm 95 for an evening service? This is a very strange thing to do. And given that Dr. Sarah is not an Anglican, I think this is the rare liturgical subtlety to have escaped us when we reviewed this story. But it did not escape some other listeners, and here is what they had to say. So my ears perked up early because the scriptural citation from Psalm 95 is not part of Anglican evensong. However, it is said daily in morning prayer. I feel like Agatha would know this, and I wonder if there is some connection to the change of the time of day in the title as well. If so, I wonder if there might be some symbolism. The mother cannot perceive the dawning of something new? The two changes in unison just strike me as too much of a coincidence to be laziness. Would be curious if you have any thoughts. Thanks for the episode, and I always find your humility and curiosity about questions of faith when Sarah is on very hospitable and inspiring. Aw, well, thank you for that, listener. That means a lot. And I have to say, I love your theory because it does also explain why Agatha Christie Mallowan took that quotation from Genesis, which is in the cool of day, and turned it into in the cool of the evening. This was something that Sarah and I discussed on the episode, and I think it's convincing to argue that she really meant to do this, both in the title and in this quotation early on in the story. She's playing with the time of day. I love that. Thank you so much for writing in. And here is one more. So this is a fascinating question. The rector is clear that the text on which he's preaching is from the morning service, and the story opens with the observation that fewer people attend the morning service. So is the rector deliberately using a text that his evening congregation would otherwise miss, because he feels that some of them, at least, need to hear it? And yet it seems they don't, because Mrs. Grierson's ears are closed to anything new or at odds with her own conception of how things should be. And the other ladies of the parish are more interested in trivia like hats. And so they do not know God. But suffer the little children to come unto me. Alan does know God and has the sort of personal relationship with him and the potentialities he offers that his mother will never have, but which the Christian faith teaches is open to believers, thanks to Christ. I like this theory as well, and I think it's safe to say that you listeners brought it when it came to in the cool of the evening. But I actually have one more message that has to do with another Star Over Bethlehem story. So here goes. I'm not sure how often you reread Agatha, but I am always in the middle of rereading one while also reading other things. I find there is so much to appreciate how much of the clues are laid out beforehand when you go back. Just started rereading Toward Zero again after watching the adaptation. And right in Chapter 1, when Superintendent Battle is talking to his daughter, he mentions the story of Saint Elizabeth. I remember this saint coming up in Promotion in the Highest and the conversation with Sarah Heinliche Wilson. I personally wasn't familiar with the stories of the saints, but thought it was amazing that Agatha's knowledge was so extensive she casually slipped it into the traditional mysteries as well. Thank you for making that connection, listener. If I had known about it, I would have mentioned it when Sarah and I covered Promotion in the Highest, which does feature a number of saints, including a Saint Elizabeth. Here is the relevant passage in Towards Zero. As the listener mentions, this is Superintendent Battle talking to his daughter and making an analogy to what she's done at her school, confessing to a crime that she never committed. This is pretty great. Here goes. There was a saint once, went out with bread for the poor. Husband didn't like it. Met her and asked what there was in her basket. She lost her nerve and said it was roses. He tore open her basket and roses it was. A miracle. Now, if you'd been Saint Elizabeth and were out with a basket of roses, and your husband had come along and asked what you'd got, you'd have lost your nerve and said, bread. So good. And yes, I think it shows that those stories of the saints were always somewhere near the forefront of Agatha Christie's prodigious brain. Okay, next message. Now, this is a response to my previous listener mailbag episode. So not my part one a few weeks ago, but one that I did about a year ago. Here goes. Hi, Kemper. I've just listened to your excellent Reader's Letters episode and thought I should respond to your appeal for eyewitnesses of the Poirot theater event. And just pausing, this was an in-person event in London that I mentioned on that mailbag episode. It was a sort of Q&A called Poirot, The Affair at the Marylebone Theatre, starring Sir David Suchet, Pauline Moran, Hugh Fraser, Philip Jackson, and David Horowitz. Also, Zoe Wanamaker was there as well, which we shall hear about in a moment. All right, back to this listener's message. The show started with the video of the start of the show, and it was a thrill to watch it with so many other Poirot lovers and the cast waiting in the wings. The first half had the 5 advertised guests, and my main takeaway was how much the characters of the actors matched the characters of their online personas. Hugh was charming and slightly vague, clearly really enjoyed making the show, and you could see how friendly he and David were. Pauline Moran could remember every part of every episode, it seemed. Dialogue, settings, the works. She was delightful and funny. Philip Jackson was laid back and had a great, dry sense of humor. David Suchet was great, serious and thoughtful, and his very seriousness about Poirot is what makes the show so good, I guess. David Horowitz had also been in one episode of Poirot, the kidnapped prime minister, so while it was a bit of a leap him being there, it wasn't completely ridiculous. And I'll just pause to note the obvious, which is that he played Inspector Slack on the Joan Hickson Miss Marple series. Mrs. Suchet was in the audience too, which was lovely. The second half had an extra, unannounced guest, Zoe Wanamaker. She hadn't got the memo that this was about Poirot, and sadly kept banging on about theater work she and David had done in the 1970s. And then this listener went on to say that she rather spoiled the second half of the evening, as the host didn't have the skill to steer the conversation away from her. That said, I was so glad to have been there, and it was lovely to be able to applaud in person the people who have brought me so much joy. Thank you for writing in about your experience, listener. I so wish I could have been there, but this is the next best thing. And I heard from other listeners about this event, so here's the next one. In your most recent podcast, you asked for any listeners who had been to see the David Suchet et al. Affair at the Marylebone Theatre to reach out. I am sorry to report that I had no idea about that event, and I'm very irked now that I'm only hearing about it after the fact, as I would absolutely have taken the train down for it. But I thought you might be interested in hearing about David Suchet's individual tour that he did in theaters around England last year, which I did attend in Newcastle. One of the most memorable parts of it was where he walked the audience through the way he prepared for his role as Poirot, from the accent to the walk. It was an incredible evening. Much of it he just spoke and reminisced, and then for a portion of it he brought someone else on stage to ostensibly interview him, although I'm sure it was all written out as a memorized dialogue. I may have been the youngest person there by about 40 years, and I'm in my 40s, but it was amazing regardless. Thank you for that, listener. Something else that I can gnash my teeth over not having attended, living here in the United States as I do. All right, I have one last listener message having to do with this live event at the Marylebone Theatre. This one starts about another topic entirely, but we will get there in the end, and it is wholly delightful. Here goes. I am Italian, but I live in Finland, and thanks to my in-laws wanting to clear up their bookshelves, we inherited old, circa 1970s, Finnish editions of most of Agatha's novels. Our 10-year-old daughter started flicking through them and found a copy of 1-2 Buckle My Shoe, which, get ready, in Finnish is titled The Two Faces of Mabel. No need to say we were completely gobsmacked by the clumsiness of the title that reveals a massive clue there in the front page. We were really wondering what went in the head of the publisher to go for this unwise choice. We even suggested that they could have called it Gerda Plays Mabel, just to make it even more obvious. And then we started joking about what other titles they could have spoiled. For example, Murder on the Orient Express could have been titled The Teamwork Makes the Dream Work. And this is not the only, albeit certainly the more obvious, misstep in the Finnish canon. Sad Cypress became Tea for Three, which still grossly points to the actual means that was used for poisoning Mary Gerard, while inaccurately indicating that the tea was for 3, whereas the tea was drunk only by 2 people, which again could work as a big hint. Anyway, Finnish translators, including those working on the subtitles of foreign TV series and movies, are notorious for missing the point over and over. So I guess this is all in line with the normal standard. Towards the end of the episode, you mentioned the Suchet's Poirot reunion that took place in February at the Marylebone Theatre in London. Unfortunately, I was also unable to attend, another of the many downsides of having moved out of the UK. So unfortunately, I cannot tell you much in first person. However, I might be able to point you towards someone who was there. You may already have heard of it, but since 2022, there is a podcast called The Labors of Hercule, hosted by Adam Roche, who has another wonderful podcast about the secrets of the golden era of Hollywood, and Frankie Pellet. They are massive fans of the TV series in particular, and the podcast focuses on going through every single episode in order. Remind you of something? Their interest is not really on the literary aspect, and the insights into the actual canon of Agatha Christie, especially if compared with All About Agatha, is very limited. However, the podcast is extremely enjoyable, and the two of them remind me a lot of you and Catherine for their wonderful chemistry. Anyway, they are now quite well known in the circle of the Suchet's Poirot fans. They interviewed Sir David, Hugh Fraser, and Pauline Moran, with Philip Jackson and Zoe Wanamaker soon to come. And they were actually invited and attended the above-mentioned reunion show, including a backstage meet-and-greet session. If you are interested, they give a thorough summary and review of the evening in one of this February's episodes of the podcast. That would be February 2025, I'm just going to note. It should be at the end of After the Funeral, or maybe Cards on the Table. Just as a warning, they were a bit puzzled and not particularly complimentary about the whole production effort, but overall I found listening to it very interesting. On a separate but linked note, I would not be surprised if the listener who wrote in to mention the sisterly love between Caroline Crail and Angela Warren were, in fact, Frankie from the podcast. She declared on more than one occasion her love for the book, for the episode, and, in particular, for the heartbreakingly poignant letter, which I really can only agree with. She actually had the sentence, "It's all right, my darling, it's all right," tattooed on her arm, and the style of the email, in a way, reminded me of her. Thank you for this nice long message, listener. And I have been aware of the labors of Hercule for a while now, and while I have to admit I have not listened to it myself, anyone who has "It's all right, darling, it's all right" tattooed on her arm has to be, well, all right by me. That's fantastic. So clearly the labors of Hercule deserves this shout out. I'm sure many of you have already been listening to this sister podcast for years now, but I figured that I would mention it. The more Christie appreciation out there in the podcasting world, the better. A rising tide lifts all boats, right? And yes, I am trying to shoehorn in some sort of a reference to There Is a Tide, which is the American title for After the Funeral, but I'm not really succeeding in doing so. Anyway. Don't touch that dial. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of our episode. We just wanted to take a moment to ask you, our dear listeners, for a favor.
If you haven't already done so, we would very much appreciate it if you take a moment to, give us a rating or a review wherever you're listening to this podcast.
It really helps the podcast out because ratings and reviews make it much easier for other Christie fans such as yourselves to find our podcast.
And the more ratings and reviews we get, the more people we can reach.
It should take you a matter of seconds, and lucky you, we're going to provide you with those seconds right now, so go to it.
Thank you so much. And now, back to our regularly scheduled programming.
Here's another response to that same long ago listener mailbag episode. I just finished your mailbag episode, which I really enjoyed. It is a pleasure to hear from so many other people out there who enjoy not only reading Christie, but also thinking and theorizing about her and her works. I loved the observation from the listener who noted that the case of the ambassador's boots appears in both Partners in Crime and Lord Edgware Dies, and that this opens up the possibility that Poirot and the Beresfords exist in the same fictional universe. I have to disagree, though, with your assertion that the references to Poirot as a literary detective in Partners in Crime negates this possibility. We know that Hastings has published his narratives of Poirot's cases, and surely the Beresfords include true crime in their extensive reading of detective stories. It makes perfect sense, then, that they would be familiar with Poirot and include him in their cosplay of great detectives. Personally, I think this is evidence in favor of the same universe theory, rather than against it. This listener is not done, but I just have to pause to note that the listener is by no means the only one to have pushed back on my argument that Poirot appearing as a fictional detective in Partners in Crime creates a paradox when he also seems to appear in the Beresford's world as a real person. The appearance of Inspector Japp in The Secret Adversary is another possible nexus between Poirot and our dear Tommy and Tuppence. Fine. I admit defeat. Tommy and Tuppence can have their cake and eat it too, where Poirot is concerned. Who am I to rein in their fun? All right, back to this listener's message. As for the suggestion that Poirot might matchmake for Tuppence and Hastings, I am still laughing. My first thought was that Tuppence is simply too much woman for Hastings to handle, but then I remembered that Cinderella is hardly a shrinking violet. Maybe our dear captain is just one more ineffectual Christie man who needs the guiding hand of a strong, capable woman to bring out the best in him. What a delightful message. Thank you, listener. All right, here's another one. Hello, Kemper. I'm a Christie fan and fan of your podcast from Finland. You have talked about foreign titles of Christie in various episodes, and I think it would be an amazing episode idea if you'd combine some of the craziest translated Christie titles and rank them. Could you ask your listeners to write you some? I'm going to do my fair share and give you my top 5 funny/weird titles in Finnish that are not one-to-one with the original title. And before I run through these, I'll pause to note how great it is that I happen to get 2 listener messages about crazy Finnish titles, right? I've done so many titles in translation at this point in these mailbag episodes and segments. But if you feel like you have read Christie in a language that has not been represented yet, and you would like to write in with some crazy titles, or even in languages that I have spoken about, if you want to give me your top 5 craziest Christie titles in translation, please do not hold back. I think this is a great idea. I'd really love to do an episode centered on titles in translation and just Christie in translation as a general proposition. I did something along those lines once a little while back, but I by no means have exhausted that topic. So let's see what I can get back. All right, returning now to this listener's top 5 crazy Finnish titles. Let's see if we have any overlap with what that other listener already identified. Do you think we will? Okay. Number 5, why didn't they ask Evans is step into emptiness or step into unknown in Finnish. And I guess that's because the initial victim goes over a cliff. Sure. By the way, that's not a spoiler because it really does happen at the very beginning of the story. All right, number 4, Sad Cypress is T for 3 in Finnish. Ding, ding, ding. First overlap. I love this title. It doesn't rhyme as well in Finnish, but in English, T for 3 is amazing. Number 3, they do it with mirrors is You Can't Fool Miss Marple in Finnish. I mean, that is a fabulous title and very true. Number 2, The Secret of Chimneys is The Secret of Love Letters in Finnish. And finally, number 1, 1, 2, Buckle My Shoe is The Two Faces of Maybelle in Finnish. The nursery rhyme titles are not the same, obviously, and also, for example, Hickory Dickory Dock is Miss Lemon Makes a Mistake in Finnish. I love that both these listeners keyed in on the spoilery insanity of that 1, 2, Buckle My Shoe title. That's really great. But I have to say that Hickory Dickory Dock title confuses me. I know that Miss Lemon is the way into the novel since her sister runs the hostel where everything happens, but is her mistake getting Poirot involved at all? I feel like Miss Lemon would not appreciate this title. Maybe we should amend it to You Can't Fool Miss Lemon. Thank you for that message, listener. And while we're on the topic of translations, I'd like to read out this long message that I got from a lovely listener and scholar of Christie who comes from the part of the world that used to be known as Yugoslavia. I won't get more specific right now because she definitely gets more specific in her message. And again, this is a long letter, even by All About Agatha listener mailbag standards, but I cherish every word of it. So here goes. Dear Kemper, I am so happy you want to hear about translations. It is a tricky business, as you will see. Before I start, I would like to give you a bit of background when it comes to languages and Christie's popularity in this part of the world. As I already mentioned, I was born and raised in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Our country was once a part of a bigger country called Yugoslavia, together with Croatia, Serbia, Montenegro, Macedonia, and Slovenia. I mention this because it is important for the understanding of the topic of languages. Yugoslavia had, at various times, a population ranging from 19 to 23 million people, and the official language was Serbo-Croatian, or Croato-Serban. It was one language with multiple standard variants. It was called the language of the peoples and nationalities of Yugoslavia, and even Slovenes and Macedonians, who have their own languages, often learned or used the Serbo-Croatian as a lingua franca. This means that any novel translated into Serbo-Croatian had the potential to reach 80 to 90% of Yugoslavia's population, again, 19 to 23 million people. Each of the countries had their own publishers of Christie, and all of these were mostly published in the 60s, 70s, and the 80s. Now, things have changed, unfortunately. Bosnia and Herzegovina does not have their own publishers of Christie. The country mainly relies on importing editions from Croatia and Serbia. So there is this huge gap/void. The precise turn of phrase escapes me, smiley face. I think maybe the word the listener is looking for is chasm. So let's go with that. There is this chasm in the market when it comes to Bosnian translations, specifically. Croatia still does it, and their publishing house, Novella, even announced that they would be publishing an all-new luxurious set of 60 Christie titles. Why not 66? Haha. And they still have editions from other publishers. Serbia also still does it, and does reprints of translations. Okay, so that's a little overview, and now this listener gets personal. My first encounter with Christie was watching Agatha Christie's Poirot, A Problem at Sea. It was 1996, I was 10, and the war had just ended. My mother was watching it on TV, and I just sort of tagged along. This was being aired on the Croatian national TV station called HRT. Back then, we would often get the rights to shows pretty late, which explains the gap between 1989, when the series started airing, to 1996. I was hooked, and I would spend every Saturday morning watching the series. Naturally, from then, I started with the novels. My mother is an avid reader. She always tried to pass that on to us, and she would read to us regularly, so she had many copies of Christie on the bookshelf. This means, Kemper, that I only ever read Christie in Bosnian, or whatever the language it was translated into was called. The one and only novel I ever read in English was Elephants Can Remember, published by Berkeley Books, New York, which explains my fondness for it, since it was the first one I ever read in English in full. Currently, I read 1 or 2 Christie titles per year, which means that I have not read many of them for almost 30 years. I read 5 Little Pigs at the end of last year, I believe, just to see if it was as good as Catherine and yourself hyped it up to be, and yes, it was. I love the Suchet episode, which had a lot of influence on my fondness for the story. The portrayal of Caroline, the wonderful actress as the daughter of Dame Diana Rigg, and Ammius were wonderful. To continue, I did a bit of research. From 1920 to today, there has been a total of 562 editions of Christie in this region, which is an impressive number considering the language fragmentations and political changes in this region. Now, I am getting this from agatha-christie.net. Agatha Christie's total global sales exceed 2 billion copies, with approximately half in English and half in translation. If we consider the 562 editions published in the former Yugoslavia, that represents around 5 to 7% of all language versions. Suffice to say that Agatha Christie was widespread in Yugoslavia. People had her on their bookshelf, and she was the cultural ideal of what crime fiction should be. She was certainly never seen as niche, but as a household name. Also, she was seen as intelligent but safe, thrilling but not too gory or macabre, political or subversive. As I write this, I can assume that you might not agree with me on some of these points, considering the Hound of Death collection and all the depictions stuck in their time. However, I mention this to convey what made her suitable for widespread translation and distribution under a controlled publishing environment. Literature that was overtly violent, sexually explicit, politically subversive, or anti-communist was often censored or avoided by state-run publishers. Oh, will I ever get to the point? Sorry, Kemper. I am getting there. To answer your question about how translators handle various tricks or other aspects of the puzzles, many of which are specific to the English language, inquiry versus enquiry in A Murder is Announced, or she versus he in Lord Edward Dies, for instance, I will say this. I am currently reading John Kern's Secret Notebooks. I am, of course, reading the translated version, published by Admiral Books, Belgrade, Serbia. Torquay is translated as Tokve, or Trockway. The battery, mentioned in 5 Little Pigs, is translated as arsenal, which made me so confused as I was reading those first chapters of the book, since it took me a while to figure out what arsenal John Curran was writing about. The Battery in the novel Five Little Pigs, as you know, is based on the one at Greenway Estate, so the Battery is an actual place, a small terrace overlooking the River Dart, where artillery batteries were once positioned for defense. However, the translator did not have this information, and seemingly no prior knowledge of Christie and Greenway, and thus translated the Battery as Arsenal. If I were translating it, I would have kept the original and simply called it the Battery, and put in a footnote explaining the meaning behind the word. That is what most of the translators from the 60s, 70s, and 80s did. A similar thing happens with the Hollow. As you and I know, it is the name of the estate in which the novel takes place. However, the word itself means something that is hollow, or something empty without content. Gerda, double meaning maybe? The hollow is not what it seems, and neither is Gerda. In BCS, I will use the abbreviation BCS for Bosnian/Croatian/Serbian from now on. It is translated as rupa, or a hole. I would have kept the original title. Also, Murder is Easy in Bosnia and Herzegovina becomes Nisigurna igra, unsafe game or risky game. Other translations of titles are quite true to the original and straightforward. I have to mention And Then There Were None and its original title. In BCS languages, it was translated as Deset Mali Kernaka. The word Kernaka is a translation given for the N-word. The word Kernaka is not problematic in BCS languages per se, since its translation into English would be a black man. However, it is problematic due to its relationship to colonial and racist stereotypes. It was not considered a racist translation back then within the local context, but it was taken and translated from English without any critical eye. This title was predominantly used in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and even 90s, and was replaced by a literal translation from the English And Then There Were None, I onda I vise nije bilo, which is an awkward phrase in BCS and is not a phrasing of words typically used. So yes, the title Deset Mali Kernaka is considered an anachronism today, here as well. However, the plural word Kernaka and the singular Kernak is used in everyday language to describe black men and a black man, although the phrase might sound rough or harsh if said with bad intent, and a more appropriate term would be to say Kirni Muskarak, which is literally translated as a black man. There are many more nuances which are very difficult to convey in an email, and it makes me certain that language really can be weaponized. I looked up translations from A Murder is Announced and Lord Edward Dies, like you asked, and they are as follows. A Murder is Announced. The title is a literal translation from the English, and it makes sense in the BCS languages. Regarding the words enquiry versus inquiry, what the translator did is to use the same phrase, raspitivanya, or asking around, thus making the original clue non-existent for the BCS speaking public. But this is not where the story ends, dear listeners. I'm skipping over a little bit of the original message, which I just think isn't totally clear, and it wouldn't make sense for me to read out in full, and moving on to this next part. I am sharing an excerpt from Chapter 23, An Evening at the Vicarage. What follows is my rough translation of this section, just to give you an idea what the translator did to handle the matter of enquiry versus inquiry. What about your list? Asked Bunch. What did you have in mind when you jotted down the word asking around? Asking around about what? Miss Marple shook her head mischievously while looking at Inspector Craddock. You missed that, Inspector Craddock. You were the one who showed me the letter that Letitia Blacklock sent to her sister. In it, the word asking around is mentioned twice, each time in singular. However, in the note that Miss Blacklock wrote, which I sent to you by Bunch, it said asking around plural. And in the BCS languages, the singular and plural versions of this word that means asking around differ by just one letter. It's at the end of the word. It's raspitivanya, ending in an E, is the singular, and then raspitivanya, ending in an A, is the plural. As you can tell, Kemper, instead of using two different words for enquiry and inquiry, they decided to rather focus on making it a plural versus singular issue, which is lost when translated back into English. So fascinating, but I love that. What a great fix, right? What a great solution. And now for Lord Edward Dies. Ah, Jane Wilkinson. I have not read the novel in ages, and I just might do so these days, just to see if Catherine's wrath was warranted. A scrap of the letter written by Carlotta to her sister Lucy appears in the English versions I managed to find online in PDF. However, that scrap illustration does not appear in my translated version. As for the solution, it is pretty straightforward in the BCS languages, since the word he is on, O-N, while the word she is ona, O-N-A. This is an excerpt from the letter Jane Wilkinson sent to Poirot and my rough translation of it. I really believe that it was very clever of me to notice that it would be quite good if I ripped out that one page and left he instead of she. I thought of all of that myself. So in this case, the clue is perfectly preserved in the translated language. I love it. All right, we only have a little bit more left of this message. One more thing. Over here, we all know how to read Cyrillic, so the Russian alphabet for Murder on the Orient Express and the double clue and the engraving on the Countess Rosikoff's cigarette case were obvious from the start. I hope to write to you again, if that is okay, as I prepare to start analyzing the translations of Christie for elements of humor and wit, and see what exactly might get a laugh from the BCS public. As you can imagine, listeners, I said it was more than okay if this listener wrote me again, and she indeed did, many months later, with this rather moving update. Today, I got my MA in translation, and my topic was the translation of humor and wit in Agatha Christie's Poirot novels, a comparative analysis of English to Bosnian/Croatian/Serbian translations. I wanted to tell you that Catherine and yourself were the inspiration for this, utterly and completely, and I want to thank you for that. The fact is, before choosing this topic, my MA thesis was related to translating wartime poetry written by Bosnia and Herzegovina's poets in the war-occupied Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia. And although I wrote a big bulk of the thesis, the topic simply proved too exhausting and gruesome for me due to unresolved war trauma, and I simply was not able to finish it. It was during this time that I started listening to the podcast and listening to you two and being inspired, and finally decided to, instead, tackle something I know and that I could write with interest and joy. In the meantime, I finished the regular podcast, love, and became a patron, which I enjoy immensely. I love all of the topics you cover. In conclusion, just saying hi and thank you from the bottom of my heart. The podcast just brings me so much joy and provides so much inspiration. I am happy to be a part of our community. I mean, this is one of my favorite messages ever. I love how deeply you are thinking about Christie and how you incorporated your love of these books into your scholarly work. And I'm still glowing, listener, from all the kind things that you said in here about me and Catherine and our podcast and our community. So thrilled to have you as part of this community. And thank you for taking the time to write all of that to us. I hope you all enjoyed that super long message because I thought it was fascinating from beginning to end. All right. Next message. Hi, Kemper. How are you? I listened this week to your cat episode and just recently to your mailbag episode and wanted to make a few comments as well. First of all, about the cats. You mentioned that Agatha Christie herself seemed to have been much more of a dog person, and this is undoubtedly true. And yet, when it comes to detectives, it is her cat-like characters that shine. You touched on this in your last episode, when you mentioned the similarities both Miss Marple and especially Poirot have to a cat. But it goes even a bit further in that her dog-like characters are clearly inferior detectives to the cat-like ones. Hastings is Poirot's faithful lapdog, and while he has his good qualities, he's far from the brilliant detective Poirot is. And even more importantly, the both completely unlikable and incompetent Giraud from The Murder on the Links is compared to a dog countless times. So the rivalry between Poirot and Giraud is basically a rivalry between a cat and a dog. And the cat wins. Poirot even buys a dog-like figure in the end to remind him of his triumph. I believe I did mention the dog statue and the comparisons to a dog that we get with Inspector Giraud, but these are all excellent points and very well made. Back to the message. Second, regarding Poirot being a fictional character in the Tommy and Tuppence universe, I don't think this is necessarily true. He's a character they read about in a book. But Dr. Shepard read about Poirot in some books written by Hastings as well, and Shepard intended to write another book about him. So Inspector Japp can be real in the Tommy and Tuppence universe, and Poirot still a character from a book without this contradicting each other. Oh my god, I get it, listeners. Poirot and the Beresfords exist in the same universe. You have won. You have won. All right, a little bit more here from this listener. I actually love the end of this message. My last points are all about love in Murder on the Orient Express. In your mailbag episode, you mentioned Mrs. Hubbard being the example of parenting love in the book. She's not the only one, however. There's also Pierre Michel, who is the father of the maid Suzanne, which gives him his motivation to take part in the murder. This is an excellent point. Secondly, Count Andrenyi's love for his wife is an interesting variation of this kind of love in Christie's oeuvre. This always gets overlooked a bit, and in my opinion, it is because of a slight oversimplification regarding the book's solution. It's remembered as the book in which they all did it. But actually, in the book, Poirot has 13 suspects, but only 12 stab wounds on the victim. And part of the solution is him trying to find out which suspect did not take part in the stabbing personally. The obvious candidate is Count Andrenyi, because he wasn't married to Helena yet at the time of Daisy's murder, and therefore not part of the Armstrong household. But Poirot deduces that he took his wife's part in the murder, meaning that the Count becomes a murderer so that his wife doesn't. I think this part of the book gets somewhat forgotten, partly because it is deleted from all the various adaptations. But it is one of my favorite parts of the book, and cutting it takes, in my opinion, a lot away from the Count's characterization. The 1974 movie, otherwise by far my favorite Orient Express adaptation, actually did this aspect worst of them all, because it shows us the trembling Countess, dagger in hand, over the body, and then the Count literally taking her hand and making her do it, which is the opposite of what the character did in the book. What a lovely distinction, listener. You're quite right that it's a touching little wrinkle in the text, and perfectly believable the way it plays out in Christie's original story. Poor Jacqueline Bisset should have been able to stay warm and comfy in her bed, like her textual counterpart, right? All right, this listener has one more point about Murder on the Orient Express. And lastly, isn't Mrs. Hubbard's offer in the end that she alone may be blamed for the murder and that the others get away a form of agape? You are on fire, listener. Agape is essentially, God's disinterested love for his creations. It's sort of a selfless love. And I think you could absolutely argue that Mrs. Hubbard, aka Linda Arden, is oozing agape in that final scene. It's obvious to me that you care very deeply for Murder on the Orient Express, which I have to say is a bit of a running theme among many of you listeners. I have noticed over the years that I consistently get impassioned messages about Murder on the Orient Express, due at least in part, I have to imagine, for the love and nostalgia that people have for that 1974 film, but due also, of course, to Christie's text. And it's funny because I think in some ways, my and Catherine's reread of Murder on the Orient Express was a little flatter than what we expected it to be. But messages like this are just a really good reminder of, I think, how powerful that book really is and how it really does deserve its spot among the top 10 Christie full-length mystery novels. I really appreciated this opportunity that you provided, listener, to revisit some of the finer points of that Christie crown jewel. All right, here is another listener talking about love. Hi, I had so much fun listening to the love-themed episode. I just heard about your podcast from my brother. I started collecting/reading Agatha Christie at around 12 and have loved her books ever since. One love story you forgot to mention was Colonel Hastings and Dulcie. I was waiting for it. Maybe I missed it? Anyway, thanks for such an awesome podcast. Keep up the great work. It is definitely worth mentioning Captain Hastings. I appreciate that you were trying to promote him in rank, but as far as I know, he never made colonel. A captain he remained for all of his days. Definitely worth mentioning Captain Hastings and his Cinderella, especially since we can feel his sadness and loneliness in Curtain once he's become a widower. Oh, Hastings. All right, this next message is from a listener who wrote in about the Parker Pyne short story, The Case of the Rich Woman. So this is the one where a woman who was initially from modest circumstances became very wealthy because her husband got rich. And then after he passes away, she is a rich widow who can't seem to find satisfaction in life. So what does she do? She goes to Parker Pyne, who says that he can make people happy, right? And without her explicit consent, Parker Pyne ends up creating this alternate reality for this woman in which she is poor, or at least not rich, once again. And though this woman rails against what seems like a fraud committed against her, she eventually embraces her new life. And by the time Parker Pyne checks in with her again, she admits to him that she is now happy. And she ends up continuing on in this new life and just giving away all of her riches, which is not something that she was willing to do at the beginning of the story. Catherine had so many thoughts about this story. I know that I have also spoken about it a bunch with Dr. Michelle Kasmer. It's such a fascinating one. And here was a really interesting gloss that one of you had on what happens to the titular rich woman. In terms of the case of the rich woman, I had a fairly visceral moral objection, but not related to the kidnapping/theft/gaslighting, etc. Not that I'm condoning that aspect, obviously. I don't know if you're familiar with the Anglican hymn, All Things Bright and Beautiful in the US, but it contains the lyrics, "The rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate. God made them high or lowly and ordered their estate," which can be interpreted as a sort of know your place classism. And the case of the rich woman, for me, read as an endorsement of that worldview. The reason Mrs. Reimer was unhappy being rich was because she was never supposed to be. Apologies if you discussed this in the podcast episode for that story. I haven't double-checked. Well, I didn't double-check either, listener. And there was a whole lot discussed on that episode between me and Catherine Brobeck. But as this theory was news to me when I read it, I'm pretty sure that Catherine and I did not go there when we discussed the short story. I absolutely see what you mean. Would this story have worked as neatly as it does if our rich woman, Mrs. Reimer, had been born into the upper classes? Not really. I don't think it would work at all, actually. Catherine and I made a lot of how outrageous Parker Pine's shenanigans are in this story in particular, but they do follow a certain logic. And I think that Mrs. Reimer's origins are very much wrapped up in that logic. It's like she's going back to her roots, right? I guess that such static notions of class are too foreign to my pushy American mind to have picked up on this myself, which is why I really appreciate you dropping me a line, listener. Very, very interesting interpretation of that story, and I think you are definitely onto something there. All right, let's move on from the Parker Pine short story collection to the Tommy and Tuppence short story collection. That would be Partners in Crime, and specifically a note about the short story The Unbreakable Alibi. Here goes. From Partners in Crime, The Unbreakable Alibi has two identical twins pretend to be the same person, Una Drake, in order to create the said unbreakable alibi by apparently being in two places at one time. The only very clunky clue to this fact that you and Catherine mentioned in your review of the story was Tommy mentioning twins in a miniature laundry list, as in, we ought to have gone to a music hall, a few good jokes about mothers-in-law and twins in bottles of beer. But I think there is another teeny tiny clue. The chambermaid at the Castle Hotel in Torquay tells Tuppence that Una Drake asked to be called the next morning at 7:30 with coffee instead of tea. However, the charwoman at Una Drake's flat in Clarges Street tells Tuppence that at the same time, Una Drake was fast asleep in her bed and hardly woke up when I brought in her tea. One has coffee, one has tea. Different people? Is it fair to make that deduction? Surely Dame Agatha wouldn't have said coffee instead of tea if it wasn't important. What do you think, Kemper? Well, I think that we should always give Christie credit, listener, and that you have indeed spotted another clue in this story. Well done, you. I very much appreciate you writing in. All right, in the same way that we've had a running theme of titles in translation in these mailbag segments and episodes, I've also gone out of my way to include any spoof or parodical versions of Christie characters over the years. And one of you wrote in about a delightful one. Here goes. The Muppet Show had a character called Miss Marble in 1995, a parody of Our Jane, a detective who helps fairy tale characters find missing or stolen items. In one episode, she is seen wearing a Holmesian deerstalker hat. Then in 2015, in another homage, a pink-faced Miss Marbles appeared in an episode entitled Mystery Weekend. The reach of Christie's universe is never ending. True that, listener. And thank you for making a connection between the Muppets and Agatha Christie. How is this the first time that is happening here on this podcast? All right, next up, I've got a message from a listener in Japan. Now that my granddaughter has become a new fan of Christie, we went to a tea shop called Salon de Christie. The tea shop is in the center of Tokyo in the office building of a publishing house specializing in mysteries. And the name of this publishing house is Hayakawa Mysteries. They serve evening tea with Christie-related cakes, sandwiches, and teas. Treacle tart and chamomile tea from 450 from Paddington, delicious death from a murder is announced, etc. The shop itself was nothing fancy, but the cakes and sandwiches were good, and all the tables had a small bookshelf with Christie's books, so we thoroughly enjoyed ourselves. Thank you, listener. And for any other listeners who are traveling to Tokyo, take note. The Salon de Christie is calling out to you. All right, I also just learned from one of you that the 1970 German language television adaptation of The Murder at the Vicarage has just been uploaded on YouTube and is free to watch with English subtitles for all of you. Although, as I learned from Dr. Mark Aldridge's Agatha Christie on Screen, which I do not get to quote nearly enough these days, apparently that German television adaptation is really more of a filmed version of a 1949 theatrical adaptation of that novel that was written by writers other than Christie. So it makes it perhaps a little less exciting, but thank you all the same to John Hissman for uploading this video onto his channel. This is the same person who uploaded those Ita Ever, Miss Marple episodes in Estonian. And if you click on his channel, I'm going to include a link to The Murder at the Vicarage in the show notes to this episode. So if you go there and then you just click on John Hissman's channel, you'll see a bunch of other goodies that he has uploaded, such as the 1969 German language, and then there were none, the 1973 German language Black Coffee, a version of The Mousetrap from Lithuania in 1986, and much, much more. So yeah, click on that link in the show notes and have a little look-see for yourself if you're interested. Okay, our mailbag has lost significant volume. It's beginning to look a little deflated, but we still have a few more fantastic messages to go. This one really tickled me. Dear Kemper, I so enjoyed your latest mailbag episode, and it made me remember that I've been meaning to email you since the last episode where you ran through a whole lot of listeners' emails and questions sometime in the fall. I'm not even sure which of the mailbag episodes this listener is referencing, but it was a while ago. One of these previous emails was from a listener who had only a few Christie novels left to read and was asking you which order to read them in. Another was from a listener who watched and rewatched a Geraldine McEwen Marple adaptation while in labor. To each their own. These two emails together made me remember my own Christie labor experience and also raised a question for me that I would be curious to know your thoughts about. I had a baby a couple of years ago. It was an extremely long labor that culminated in an emergency C-section. The baby and I were both fine. Once the C-section was over, I was exhausted and barely able to hold my newborn. The nurses decided my husband should hold him so that I could take a nap before they transferred me to the post-delivery ward. For some reason, drugs? Even though I was out of my mind with tiredness, I was worried that I wouldn't be able to sleep. My husband and I often listen to Agatha Christie adaptations on BBC Sounds as we go to sleep, so I asked him to play the John Moffat Poirot that was at the time being serialized, which was Taken at the Flood. Needless to say, I fell asleep within 12 seconds and heard not a word of it. But my husband's first hour of fatherhood and my son's first hour in the world took place with the Christie soundtrack. All this is well and good, except I don't actually like Taken at the Flood very much at all. It's close to the bottom of my own personal rankings. And B, I have never read Postern of Fate or The Secret of Chimneys. Should I feel guilty that this was my son's introduction to Christie and indeed to the whole of literature? If I'd planned ahead, perhaps I would have chosen that beautiful ending of Middlemarch you referred to, read by Juliet Stevenson. Have you listened to the audiobook? Stevenson is the most brilliant reader, and of Austen's novels too. I can't recommend her highly enough. But my real question is, what Christie would you pick as an introduction to her oeuvre, and detective fiction in general, for a newborn or otherwise? I don't think I've heard you discuss this question before. My feeling is that Roger Ackroyd, Orient Express, and Then There Were None, although the Christies in many ways, aren't good choices, since a lot of their pleasure derives from how they subvert a genre already familiar to the reader. Plus, the last of those three is simply too scary. I know you have young children yourself. Have you decided what their first Christie will be? Will you introduce them to the adaptations first, or wait until they're able to read the books? Thank you for indulging my memories and questions here, as well as for providing me with such entertainment over the years. I also want to say how much I appreciate the way you continue to keep Catherine so present on the podcast. It's very moving and a tribute to your friendship as well as to everything she brought to All About Agatha and the field of dark marble studies. Thank you for that message, listener, especially that last bit about Catherine. That's really lovely. In the past, I have answered the question, what do you think is the best first Monsieur Poirot or Miss Marple novel? Generally, I say Evil Under the Sun and The Body in the Library, respectively. But that goes for a child somewhere between 10 and 12, or anyone older who hasn't yet read Christie. And for the record, my children are not old enough yet. But I'm intrigued by your question as to which Christie you might want to have playing for your newborn baby to imbibe by way of osmosis. Perhaps just because it's a fairly insane question. I mean, I'd probably suggest that you play some soothing music instead. But if I had to pick a text, you're going to laugh at me, but I think that I would have to say, wait for it, the autobiography. Because obviously I am obsessed with the autobiography, it's true. But practically the first third of that book is all about an idyllic childhood and what makes a good marriage and a happy family and what could be better fodder for your little newborn to absorb by osmosis. So the autobiography it is, though if anyone out there has strong feelings on this subject, what a newborn baby should listen to from the Christie oeuvre within the first minutes of life, I would love to hear from you. All right, I have another sort of open question here from one of you listeners. Hi, Kemper. Wanted to drop a question for the mailbag. We hear the phrase, the next Agatha Christie, thrown out for a lot of authors, most commonly Janice Hallett and Anthony Horowitz, who, as you know, was a writer on Poirot. With respect to all of these very talented writers, none of them seems to have the level of celebrity that I believe Christie had. If I were to choose an author who comes close to Agatha Christie, I'd say it's J.K. Rowling, though she is famous for her fantasy work, not her mystery work. I was wondering who you would label as the next Agatha Christie, and which parameters would you use to define what it means to be the next Agatha Christie? This is a really good question, and a slightly different one from which authors or filmmakers or whoever are successfully creating in the mode of Christie. That is actually a question that I will consider at some length with my next guest on the podcast, but more on that in a few moments when I tell you what my next episode is. In my little outro, that's my tease for you to keep you listening to me when the music starts playing. I do think that Richard Osman has a pretty massive following at this point, especially in the UK, but also around the world. And that following is due both to what he writes, but also who he is. I think partly the problem is that even though Agatha Christie was a publishing phenomenon when she was alive and grew more and more successful the older she got, the phenomenon of her celebrity now has a lot to do with the fact that she's no longer with us, right? And what we have sort of chosen to imprint on her. So I'm not sure that we can identify anyone who really fits into the Christie mold as we've come to see Christie today. I don't know. I'm honestly a bit stumped by this question, which was why I wanted to make sure that I included it, because I'm now opening it out to all of you. What do you think? Who is the Agatha Christie of today, or perhaps tomorrow? Who do you think might become the Agatha Christie of tomorrow in terms of reach and enduring popularity? It's a really interesting question. Okay, as you can tell, I am ending this mailbag episode with lots of open-ended questions here. Some thinkers for you all to ponder. Here's the next one. Thank you for All About Agatha, which I've been enjoying since the start. Haven't listened to all the episodes because although I did read all the Christies when I was young, there's many that I don't remember well and want to reread before analyzing. Spoiler warnings much appreciated. Anyway, I have a question which I think you are the ideal person to address because of the way you've thoughtfully discussed gay and queer-coded characters and their representation. So, are there any bi or bi-coded characters anywhere in the oeuvre? I haven't come across a single one yet in my rereads as an adult. Bi erasure is unfortunately not uncommon, even in many who seem quite positive, for their time/location, toward lesbian and gay representation. Human brains love to create a hard binary out of a spectrum. It seems to me that in Christie, all the implied gay characters, whether benignly camp or twisted and obsessional, are always only attracted to their own gender and unable to form relationships with the other. Has any character in any of her books or stories been depicted as capable of attraction to both men and women? Or was she one of those who think we don't exist? Well, this strikes me as such an interesting and important question I actually wrote back to this listener, and, the two characters who just sprang to my mind didn't really satisfy me. I thought of Lord Edgware from Lord Edgware Dies, who is married to Jane Wilkinson, but is also depicted as engaging in some sort of a relationship with a man who is in a subservient role to him, major power dynamic issues going on there. I mean, this is definitely a portrayal of a gay male character that would fall more into the twisted/obsessional camp. But he does have a relationship both with a woman and a man. And then I also thought about Verity Hunt in Nemesis. Now, I have gone on record as not interpreting Nemesis to really be about same-sex love or attraction. I know many of you out there disagree with that, but there is an argument to be made that Verity Hunt, she is said to go through a phase in which she engages in hero worship with older women. That perhaps is when she grew close to Clotilde Bradbury Scott. She then moved away and became interested in Michael Raphael, right? Would anyone really call her a bisexual character? No, but she did pop into my brain. This is a tricky question. It's very subjective because it has to do with interpretation of the texts, but that doesn't mean that we can't ponder it together. So if anyone has any thoughts or suggestions here, I would love to be able to share them with this listener and with all of you in a future mailbag episode. All right, I have just two more items. First, a big old friend of the podcast suggested to me recently that I should generate a top 10 list of titles by other authors for those who have run out of Christie's to read. That this would be an excellent episode because it might actually really help a lot of people, because I think many of us here within the All About Agatha community have shared in this pain, right? We have read everything that there is to read by Agatha Christie, and then where do we turn to next? What other authors can at least offer us a shadow of the satisfaction that our beloved Dame Agatha Christie does? I've talked about many other mystery authors on this podcast, especially in interviews with contemporary mystery authors and also on the podcast's Patreon feed. But I really like this idea, so I am putting out an open call to all of you to write to me at allaboutthedame@gmail.com with those rare books that scratched the Christie itch for you. What were they? Why did they work as well as they did? And I just may end up featuring your favorite non-Christie mystery on a future episode. I think this is a great idea for an episode. And then finally, I have wanted for a while to do an episode about Christie in the classroom. I think so many people are first exposed or exposed in a significant way to Christie in high school or even in college. There are many who talk about having read And Then There Were None, for instance, in a high school English class, and that being their entryway into Christie. Perhaps this is a little bit more common in the United States. I'm not sure, but I would love to hear from any English teachers, or I should say literature teachers. This does not have to be an English-only thing. I would love to hear from anyone who has taught Christie within a classroom setting, because I'd love to do a sort of roundtable with these folks and just to talk about what it's like to teach Christie in a classroom. I think that is an angle that I have not yet taken on this podcast, and I would really love to, because it is such an important entryway to Christie for so many people. And who doesn't want to hear from teachers, right? They're the best. So if you have ever taught Christie and you would be open to speaking with me about it, drop me a line at allaboutthedame@gmail.com and let's talk. And with that, we are at long last done with part 2 of my listener mailbag episode. The mailbag is so very empty now. It's just sagging there like a lifeless little sack. But you know what? I am confident that before long it will be full to bursting once again. Thank you to all you listeners who contributed to this episode. I really can't think of a better Valentine's Day themed episode, because these messages really are the best proof of all of the love that you have for Christie, and more generally for the pursuit of reading and fanning out over Christie, which is something that we all love to do together. I'm so happy to be doing all of this with all of you. Happy Valentine's Day. For my next episode, I will be interviewing Dr. John Curran, who has a new book out. It's called The Murder Game: Play, Puzzles, and the Golden Age. I have so much to talk about with Dr. Curran. It's always a lively conversation when he comes on this podcast, so I really can't wait for that. And I, of course, encourage you to check out the podcast's Patreon feed if you would like to listen to some bonus content. February's episode is all about Verdict, the original play Verdict by Agatha Christie, which should really be called No Fields of Amaranth by Mary Westmacott. And if that doesn't make sense to you, well, I guess you're just going to have to go on over to Patreon and listen to my episode. You can email me at allaboutthedame@gmail.com, and please do. You can find the podcast on Instagram at allaboutagatha, and you can find me at my author website, www.kemperdonovan.com. Links to all of this in the show notes, as well as a link to the third book in my Ghostwriter Mysteries series, Sweet Spot, which you can pre-order now. That will be out in July of this year, out this summer. And in the show notes, you can also find links to the first two books in that series, The Busybody and Loose Lips. Thank you so much to those of you who have already given the podcast a rating and or a review, but I know there are many of you that have not, so please just take a moment to do that. It really helps me out. It's quite meaningful. And I'll see you next time. Bye.